Hi everyone, I'm Cheska and I'm in my final year of my PhD here at Leeds Beckett in the Department of Psychology. So a big thank you to Lauren and to QUALMS for inviting me to talk today about my study and also for giving me the opportunity to pick your brains a bit about narrative case study analysis, which is the method that I'm about to embark on with data from my qualitative longitudinal study with recipients of online sperm donation. So as this is a method support session, I'm not going to be talking for the whole time, so I am going to try and introduce some breakout rooms. If we can do that, Kat's going to try and help me do that towards the end. And there's going to be opportunities to discuss the challenges of doing this kind of analysis, and also have a think about some potential solutions to those challenges. So I'm going to just start off by giving a little bit of background about my project, and then I will talk in a little bit more depth about my qualitative longitudinal study and the different types of data that I've been collecting over the last year. Then I'll briefly introduce narrative analysis as a method and some of its features, and I'll talk you through some of the sort of ideas that I've had about how I'm going to analyse my data. And then, yeah, like I say, I'm going to invite you to discuss the challenges of embarking on that kind of analysis. And hopefully you can help me to come up with some solutions and new and exciting ways of approaching my data. So, start off. So firstly, what is online sperm donation? So online sperm donation is a relatively new phenomenon where individuals who do not have access to sperm for whatever reason are going online to meet people who will give them sperm in order for them to have a baby. So it's not regulated, and it is different from sperm donation via clinics. It doesn't involve any medical professionals, nor does it involve any testing of the sperm or an assisted reproductive technology like IVF or IUI. It's facilitated by websites, and they function in a really similar way to dating websites. So people can create a profile and state what they're looking for example, lesbian couple looking for a sperm donor with limited contact. Sorry, I've just lost my thing. And then donors can express an interest into donating to those people if they view their profile. So most of the time, donors will then come to the recipient's home, or sometimes they'll meet up at a hotel, and they can produce their sample, and then they'll hand it over to the recipient, who may then self-inseminate, or their partner might do that if they have one. So online sperm donation is most commonly undertaken by lesbian couples and single women, for whom the regulated sperm donation route at clinics is increasingly difficult to access. I'm not going to say too much more about that, but if you would like to learn a bit more about online sperm donation as a phenomenon, then we do currently have an article, a paper that is in press, well, nearly in press, with Frontiers in Global Women's Health. So I will sort of provide updates on that via my Twitter, and I'll put my Twitter at the end so you can sort of follow that side of the research if you want to. Yeah, so like I say, I'm not going to say too much more about online sperm donation right now, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. So moving on to my study then, I conducted a systematic review, and I found that there was very little research on the experiences of recipients who were undertaking this route to parenthood. And particularly qualitative and longitudinal accounts of recipients were lacking. So I designed a study which sought to respond to the following aims that you can see on the screen. So firstly, I wanted to explore how and why recipients were undertaking online sperm donation. I also wanted to think about how recipients navigate online sperm donation over time, and to identify their experiences and the factors that shape these. And thirdly, I wanted to explore how those who have conceived using sperm obtained from an online donor experienced pregnancy. So just to run through the methods that I used, I recruited 8 recipients or recipient couples who were just at the start of their search for a sperm donor using online platforms. So I interviewed them online using Zoom and using narrative interview techniques at 0, 6, and 12 months. And I asked participants to create timelines at the beginning of the first interview, which would act as a prompt for them to talk about their experiences. And the idea behind that was that I was sort of acknowledging that it might be quite difficult for them to articulate things, and to have a prompt might be quite useful. So at the first interview, I asked them to draw a past timeline using an online tool. And that depicted significant events that led up to their decision to search for a donor online. And at the end of the first interview, I asked them to draw a future timeline using the same online tool, which would depict what they hoped would happen in the next 12 months over the course of the research. And then at the end of the final interview, we returned to those future timelines that they'd drawn in the first interview, and they were asked to reflect on their experiences in light of what they had envisaged in that timeline. And those were really interesting chats. Some were really lovely because they had sort of achieved everything that they'd set out to do, and some were a bit more difficult because they maybe hadn't. I also invited the recipients to join a secret Facebook group, so no one could see that they were a member of it. And on there, they were invited to interact with each other, to share advice, tips, updates on their journey, any photos, as well as messages of support. Again, like given the sort of relative stigma surrounding online sperm donation and the fact that online sperm donors tend to run most of the websites and forums, the aim of the group was to create a space where the recipients could speak about their experiences freely and free from judgment and free from the sort of involvement of the donors, who really tend to sort of take the lead in those online spaces. So I completed my last interview on Wednesday last week, and all the participants who are a part of the Facebook group have asked if we can keep it going. So the plan is that I'm going to hand over administration of the group to them. And they're going to run it, and they want to all sort of stay in touch with each other, which is really nice. So moving on to the data. So obviously the methods that I adopted meant that a lot of data was produced over the course of the last year. So once I've finished transcribing these final interviews, I'm going to have 17 interview transcripts of between 20 and 30 pages each, 7 participant-produced past timelines, 7 participant-produced future timelines, my own reflections that I wrote at the end of each interview, and they sort of vary in length. And I'll have approximately 40 threads from the Facebook group, which contain between 2 and 30 comments on each thread. So they've been recorded in an Excel spreadsheet as I've been going along. And then I've also got around 10, maybe a few more now, photos and videos that were shared by participants on the Facebook group and also emailed to me. So I've just included some examples of the more visual data that was sent to me for you to have a look at. So on the top left, you've got an example of one of the future timelines that someone wrote. And she sort of put these like time markers on there. So firstly, she wanted to find a donor. And then the next one sort of relates a bit to COVID. So she was hoping that restrictions could be lifted so that she could go and like meet the donor in person. The next one was that she wanted to think about maybe going on some different sites from the one that she was using when she was talking to me, if she hadn't found anyone suitable on that one. And then she mentioned that she wanted to find a bigger house ready for baby number 2. So these were the sorts of things that they were putting on like sort of big life markers which was really nice to see. And she did actually buy a bigger house. She told me last week. So they're in, but they don't have a baby yet. And the other kinds of things that are here, the bottom left, there you've got the ovulation tests. People were really very closely monitoring their ovulation. A couple of scans, a picture of someone's bump. The nursery is in the bottom right, so they were sort of making preparations for that. That one now has a baby in it. And then the top, you've got some baby grows. So before I talk about the method that I've chosen to adopt, I do want to briefly mention some of the key features of narrative analysis more generally. So it's important to acknowledge that as humans, we communicate and create meaning through narratives every day of our lives. So for instance, at the start of this session, I told you a little bit about who I am, my name, what I do, and my institution. And this initial introduction is an example of an autobiographical narrative. It helps you as an audience to make sense of who I am as the storyteller. So that's just one example of how we're constantly using narratives to construct and give meaning to the world around us. And it's important to point out that narrative analysis takes many, many different forms, and there's no set way of doing it. So Reisman and Quinney portray narrative analysis as a continuum, where at one end you might have entire life stories, and at the other you might have more discrete situated stories as the unit of analysis. And the method that I've chosen, or the one that I hope to use, sits somewhere in the middle of this continuum. So narratives are used by individuals to express their interpretation of things that they experience. So that means that narratives are not necessarily expressing the truth of what happened at any one time, but how the individual narrating that experience has reconstructed it. So narratives exist in context. For instance, everyone who is a part of this session will be experiencing it really differently. So you might be sat in an office, or you might be at home, you might be on your sofa or in your car, and you might be enjoying it, or you might be really bored. I hope not, but I can not do anything about that. You're in here now. And so there's no one true way of representing this shared experience that we're all having. And the way we narrate this experience is also entirely dependent on who is telling it and who is listening to it. So your account of this session would be really different if you were telling your colleague than if you were telling a 5-year-old child. Another aspect of narrative that is especially important for social scientists is the power structures that inform, change, and shape how narratives are told, who can tell them, and whether we as a society are ready to listen to them. So in his book, Telling Sexual Stories, which is an amazing book on narrative, if you haven't heard of it, I definitely read it. Ken Plummer tells us that stories can be heard when a community has been fattened up, rendered ripe and willing to hear such stories. And he then goes on to explain that while you could come out as a gay man in the 1960s, you would do so almost in complete isolation, or to what he calls the homosexual underworld. And he notes that to turn that private personal tale into one that could be told publicly and loudly is a task of immense political proportions. So just to move on and think a little bit more practically, those who undertake narrative analysis must place emphasis on preserving the sequential and the structural elements of any given narrative. So the way that narratives are structured, including what was said before and what was said after, will shape the recounting of that experience. So to illustrate that, on the following slide, I've taken an example from a transcript from my research, and I'm going to try and demonstrate the importance of sequence in narrative analysis. So in this example, I was asking Jessica, one of my participants, about how she felt as her and her partner Jenny were traveling to meet their donor for the first time. So in the first example, she says that she was really excited till we got about 15 minutes away, she says, and then I started to feel sick, like I'm going to be sick. She says, and then we were scared because we were meeting a random man in the middle of nowhere. The second example, so just below it, contains exactly the same elements of the story, but slightly reordered. And as you can see, that story ends with her saying that she was really excited. So what happened next? Well, she then goes on to say at the bottom there, so that's when we decided, and she laughs, I've just remembered we brought like not weapons per se, but I had a pair of like tin snips, which are like really heavy, like clamps. And then Jenny had a wrench just in the back of her car in case anything went wrong. So the first example is the actual sequence of the narrative, which shows a really quite non-random sequence of events. So it goes from her feeling excited to sick to scared to the point where she and her partner are discussing whether they have any weapons. So you can see this sequence of events unfolding in a causal pattern. Whereas in the example that I created that ends in her being excited, it wouldn't really make sense for her to then start talking about weapons. So what I've tried to illustrate there is the importance of taking the narrative as a whole, as opposed to a sum of its parts, which we do tend to do in other forms of qualitative analysis. So if I were to code this as donations can be exciting, without thinking about the fact that that excitement then turned into a completely different emotion and a completely different experience, I wouldn't really be accurately sort of representing her account. I hope that makes sense. So in order to avoid pulling narratives apart, narrative case study analysis, which is what I will be using, allows us to keep that data together. The whole case becomes the unit of analysis. So within narrative case study analysis, I hope to also use the narrative or life thread model, which was coined by Ellis Hill et al. In their study on identity and rehabilitation following stroke. So the idea is that the participant's account is represented by a number of narrative threads, which combine together to denote relevant storied accounts of the data. So the metaphor of a thread represents the connection between the past, the present, and the future, and the idea that certain events can cause the threads to become frayed or to break apart, like you can see in the figure at the bottom. And the metaphor is most commonly used in accounts of health and illness research, and particularly when something like an accident or an injury has happened suddenly and caused like an immediate sort of narrative break or a fraying or a snapping of those threads. So in a similar way, I see undertaking online sperm donation for my participants as an experience that can often be difficult to articulate. And to follow Ken Plummer, I'm not convinced yet that society is fully fattened up and ready to hear those individual stories of online sperm donation. And I also get the sense that deciding to undertake online sperm donation brings individuals to the point where their narratives may start to become frayed, especially given some of the obstacles that are in the way of achieving what they hope to. So thinking a little bit more about how I might conceptualize the analytic process, I drew on Whiffen et al. In their 2014 paper, where they depict these sort of 3 layers of narrative analysis. Given that I interviewed the participants 3 times over a year, I intend to start off by identifying each of the individual's narrative threads at the different time points. And then following that, I will interrogate the longitudinal narratives of each of the cases and thinking about how those threads persist over time. And then finally, I want to try and read across the cases. So looking at how and which threads are shared across the cohort. And so that is about as far as I've got in terms of conceptualizing that process of analysis. And I'm also really conscious that while there are a lot of papers that have used narrative analysis, those papers have tended to distill the process. And so that makes it really difficult to think about the actual practicalities of conducting this kind of research, this kind of analysis, sorry. And so they're the things that I would really like for us to discuss today. If that's okay, I'm going to put it to you guys. So thinking about the challenges and the practicalities of this analysis in the ways that I've described, using those types of data that I've been collecting over the last year. So with that in mind, I wondered if now we could start going into some breakout rooms and think about what the practical challenges of undertaking the analysis might be. And then if possible, I'd like us to sort of feedback and think about that, and then maybe go into the breakout rooms again, or we could discuss these together. How might I overcome some of those challenges? So if we've got any ideas for the sorts of things that I could do to make this as easy and painless as possible for me, but also to make sure that I represent my participants' accounts in the most empathetic and sort of full and rich way as I can.